Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 89, Baekje and Yamato on the Rocks. Last episode, we covered the continued rise of Buddhism, from the enigmatic Prince Ohowake and his importation of experts and texts to found a temple in the Naniwa region, to the more well-documented case of Soga no Umako, who continued his father's efforts to establish a temple at their home in Asuka, going so far as to have 3 women inducted as nuns, the first clergy we know of to have been ordained in the archipelago, even though it may have been less than perfectly orthodox in the manner of ceremony. We also talked about how a coalition of other court nobles, led by the Mononobe family, were undermining the Soga and accused their newfangled religious ideas of bringing plague to the people. Plague that, even though the Soga's temple was destroyed to prevent it, nonetheless took the life of the sovereign, Nunakura Fotadamashiki, aka Bidatsu Tennou. And for many, that's probably the highlight of this reign, which was deeply involved in the spread of Buddhism, as well as providing the roots of the conflict between the old guard of the Mononobe and the newly risen Soga family. However, it isn't as if that is all that was happening. There were continued international developments, among other things, and these were intertwined with everything else going on. Nothing was happening in a vacuum. For example, the country of Baekje was the source of many of the early Buddhist texts and professionals, with Buddhist gifts becoming a part of the tributary diplomacy that is depicted in the Chronicles at that time. Whereas earlier diplomatic gifts may have included bronze mirrors, many embossed with figures such as Queen Mother of the West, in the 6th century, Buddhist icons and imagery seem to hold a similar currency. I'd also note that giving Buddhist images and texts as gifts or tribute held an added layer of meaning, at least from a Buddhist interpretation. After all, not only were you providing prestige goods, which then helped boost the status of one's diplomatic partners, but it also earned merit for the person gifting such things, as they were then able to make the claim that they were helping to spread the teachings of the Buddha. This provided an appeal to such gifts on multiple levels, both within and without the growing Buddhist world. At the same time that Baekje and Yamato continued to advance their ties, Shilla continued to grow. Since absorbing the states of Gara or Gaia, including the Yamato-allied state of Nimna, Shilla had grown and was consolidating its power. Shilla itself had started out as a coalition of about 6 city-state-like polities that came together in a single union. They were one of the main targets of early Yamato aggressions on the Korean peninsula, with numerous discussions of raids by quote-unquote Wa sailors, though little is typically seen of the reverse. The Chronicles make the claim that early Shilla was a subordinate tributary state of Yamato, which modern historians regard as little more than fiction, likely part of the propaganda campaign of the Yamato court attempting to place themselves in the superior position. Still, it does seem reasonable that prior to the 6th century, Shilla had remained a relatively minor state, occasionally allying with or against the states of Baekje and Goguryeo, as well as the other independent polities that were once present but have largely been obscured by the uncertain mists of the past. The fact that they survived as long as they did, and thus had so much written material, speaks to why they loom so much larger in the early histories, but such things are always hard to judge when all of your material basically comes from the winners, historically speaking. I mean, just think how, if Kibi or Tsukushi or even Izumo had become the dominant polity in Japan, our chronicles would focus much more on what happened there, rather than just covering what was happening in the Nara Basin and adjacent Kawachi Plain all the time. And then there is the state of Goryeo, known today as Goguryeo or Old Goryeo. In many ways, it was the grand dame of the 3 kingdoms of ancient Korea, with the greatest claim to the territory of ancient Gojoseon and Buyo culture. Back in episode 86, we saw a few of their attempts at diplomatic relations with Yamato landing along the Japan Sea side of Honshu, possibly a side effect of the path they were taking, likely sailing down along the eastern coast of the Korean peninsula, rather than via the Bohai Sea in the west. This may also have been indicative of the relatively friendly relations between Goguryeo and the expanding state of Shilla. Shilla also offered up a normalization of relations with Yamato, though it was met with mixed results. And even those mixed results are, well, mixed in terms of just what was really happening versus what was being projected back by the chroniclers writing a century or two later. Back in the previous reign, that of Ame Kuniyoshi, aka Kimmei Tenno, Shilla envoys had also been received sometime after their conquest of Nimna, and the chronicles at least indicate that Yamato was less than enthusiastic to receive them, indicating that tensions remained high, and Ame Kuniyoshi took every opportunity to admonish Shilla and to request that Nimna be reestablished as an independent entity. Or at least that's what we're told. Similarly, in the 11th month of 574, Shilla sent another embassy, but we have very little information on it. Given the timing, it may have been intended to express their condolences on the death of Ame Kuniyoshi and their congratulations to Nunakura for ascending the throne. About 4 months later, in 575, Baekje also sent an embassy, and we're told that this one sent more tribute than normal, possibly as a congratulations again to Nunakura and an attempt to strengthen the Baekje-Yamato alliance. There may have also been a request for more specific assistance, since Nunakura apparently took the time to remind the imperial princes, as well as the new Oomi Soga no Umako, to remain diligent regarding the matter of Nimna. As Aston translates it, he specifically said, "Be not remiss in the matter of Nimna." Yamato was still apparently displeased with the fact that Nimna, which was once an ally, was still under Shilla control. Following that admonition, the Yamato court sent their own envoys to Baekje and then to Shilla, though specifically they sent the embassy to Shilla-controlled Nimna, at least according to the chronicles. A couple of months later, Shilla sent an embassy back, including more tribute than normal, though the only hint of why, beyond the previous mention of Nimna, is that Shilla was including tribute for 4 more townships, which seems kind of a weird flex, but may have been an indication of their growth as well as a diplomatic notification that these 4 areas were part of what Shilla now considered their territory. The full reasons Baekje and Shilla sent more tribute than normal, really unclear. It could have been part of a recognition of Nunakura's coronation and an attempt to butter up the new administration, and it's possible that both Baekje and Shilla were vying for Yamato favoritism as well. Shilla may also have been trying to basically pay off Yamato and get them to forget the whole thing with Nimna ever happened. Something that, as we shall see, was not really gonna happen. Yamato sent another mission to Baekje in 577, 2 years later. This was the mission of Ohowake no Miko and Ogoro no Kishi, from which Ohowake brought back various accoutrements and set up a temple in Naniwa, modern Osaka. We discussed this as well as our ignorance over the actual person of Ohowake no Miko in our last episode, episode 88. It is interesting, however, if Ohowake no Miko was the actual individual who went to Baekje. Mostly we see lower-ranking men. Those from Kishi-level families are similar, like his partner, Oguru no Kishi. Occasionally we see a Muraji or Omi-level family that sends someone, particularly at the head of a military force, but not so often do we see a prince of the blood making the dangerous journey across the sea. I have to assume that this was an important mission and that seems to have been borne out when you consider just what was brought back. Despite all of that, the details are frustratingly vague, worse than trying to find and put together the oldest episodes of Doctor Who and the First Doctor. We do know that the whole trip took about 6 months, which gives a sense of what it meant to undertake one of these journeys. Most of that would have been living at the distant court. They didn't have phones, let alone email, so they couldn't really send word ahead with exact details as to when they were leaving and where they were on their way, although there may have been some informal communication networks via the many fishermen and traders who regularly worked the straits. More likely, an embassy would simply show up in a boat one day and start asking the locals to take me to your leader. Once you got there, they hopefully had room for you. They might even have a special location for you and your entourage to stay while they went through the formalities. After all, someone had to get you on the schedule, and any diplomatic gifts, tribute, should be cataloged and written down before the meeting. That way the host country could figure out just what they were going to reciprocate with. There's also possible training in any local ceremony and customs, as you couldn't assume that foreign dignitaries necessarily knew what was expected. And then there would be translating, likely through a shared language, possibly using Cynic characters if everyone is literate. Also, during that time, the mission would probably have been hosting guests or being invited out by some of the local elites. They were both guests and curiosities of a sort. And there might have been some personal trading and bartering going on off to the side. After all, you got to pay the bills somehow, and as long as nothing eclipsed the diplomatic mission, then I suspect there were some other trade goods that these ambassadors brought to help barter with locals and ensure they could bring back various goods and souvenirs for themselves and their own families. In some cases, and it's unclear if it was by choice or not, ambassadors might be invited to stay longer, even settle down with a local wife and family. And there are several examples of this that we see in the Chronicles, so it wasn't all that rare. So that was the mission from Yamato to Baekje. The next mission from Scylla came in 579, some 4 years later, and we're told that they brought tribute that included a Buddhist image. And then, only a year after, we have another mission from Scylla, but it was dismissed before it could ever be received. And that is a bit odd. Why would Yamato not receive the embassy? And heck, why wouldn't they explain why they didn't receive the embassy in the Chronicles? We just really aren't given a reason. And the entry is pretty short, all things considered. We do know the names of the envoys. Indeed, the name of two envoys, Atonama and Chilshonama, tried again 2 years later, but they were again dismissed without accepting the tribute. And it's all quite odd, but it does go to show the fickle nature of foreign relations. One possibility may have to do with the way that tribute diplomacy appears to have worked. We know that in the case of the Han, Wei, and even the Tang and later dynasties, states were encouraged to come as tributaries, bringing goods as part of their diplomatic embassy, and then the receiving state was expected to provide items of even greater value in return. In the 16th century, various daimyo, or Japanese warlords, would use this to their advantage, representing themselves as legitimate emissaries in order to get the Ming Dynasty court to give them greater gifts in return. As multiple embassies showed up, all claiming to be the Japanese representatives, the Ming court started a policy of only accepting the first one that came, as they had no real way to tell who was the legitimate ruler during the chaos of the Warring States period. I bring that up because I noticed that the first mission by Atonama and Chilshonama took place only 8 months or so after the one in 579, which brought the Buddhist image. Given the typical time between embassies, that seems very short, and it seems quite possible that the Yamato court didn't believe that the embassy was real, and that it was too soon after the previous one. Or it could have been even more mundane. It's possible the court didn't have the stores to pay out against the tribute, though that isn't the reason that they would have given for turning them away. After all, it was not exactly a safe journey to cross the ocean and make your way all the way to the Japanese archipelago. Whether you hopped down the island chain or took a more direct route using the island of Okinoshima as a guidepost in the middle of the strait was not particularly easy, and many embassies never made it across or back. I suspect, however, that there was something else going on, and that is in part because it seems to be the same two individuals coming back 2 years later, and they were once again turned away. It's possible that Nunakura and the Yamato court had a specific beef with these two individuals, but in that case, they probably would have sent word to Scylla to tell them to send someone else. This probably is indicative of the growing tensions between Yamato and Scylla. Now, from a narrative sense, it would make sense for Yamato to accept envoys just after a new sovereign came to power. It would help legitimize a sovereign, and it also offers a chance to reset and reestablish the relationship. The second envoy, bringing a Buddhist image, would certainly be something that the chroniclers would find historically interesting and would bolster their own thoughts about the rising importance of Buddhism in the period. However, as we see in an episode from 583, Nunakura was still concerned about trying to reestablish Nimna. I suspect that this may have been a condition that Yamato court placed on Scylla and the envoys, and it's possible they just weren't willing to discuss anything without at least discussing that. Or at least that may be the impression the chroniclers wish to give. They are still referring to it as Mimana or Mimana no Nihonfu, making claims that it was the Yamato government's outpost on the peninsula and therefore something of a personal blow to the Yamato court for it to have been overrun. Trying to reestablish Nimna would become something of a rallying cry, almost like remember the Alamo or remember the Maine. Regardless of the truth behind either incident, they were both used as justifications for war at the time. The case of Mimana was used to justify Yamato actions on the peninsula, and it would continue to be brought back up all the way until modern times, including helping to justify Japan's invasion of Korea in the early 20th century. Here I'll interject with the possibility that there could also have been some internal issues the court was dealing with. Specifically, in between these two missions by Atonama and Chilshonama, there was a bit of a disruption on the northeastern frontier as the people known to the court as emishi rose up in rebellion. We aren't given the details, as per normal, but we are told that several thousand emishi showed hostility. The chronicle then claims that the sovereign simply summoned the leaders, including a chief named Ayakasu, who may have been a chief of chiefs or something of that sort, and then Nunakura reamed them all out, suggesting that he would put the leaders, i.e. Ayakasu and the other chieftains, to death. Of course, the rebellious chieftains immediately had a change of heart and pledged an oath to support Yamato. Much more likely, I suspect, there was rising tension and hostility in the frontier regions, and Yamato likely had to raise a force to go face them. Assuming that was the case, it would have taken time to travel out there, subdue any uprising, and then drag the leaders back to the court to make of them an example to others. If that was the case, then it may have been that Yamato simply did not feel they had the time to deal with Atonama and his crew. For a bit clearer reference, from the 8th through the 11th years of the reign, there are simply relatively short entries. So in 579, there's the mission of Chilcho Changnama, who brought the Buddhist image. Then in 580, we have Atonama and Chilshonama, attempting to offer their tribute. Then in 581, there is a rebellion of the Emishi, followed in 582 by another attempt by Atonama and Chilshonama to offer tribute. That's about all we have to go on. However, we do have a very clear indication in 583, only 9 months after again refusing tribute from Atonama and crew, that Nimna was once more on the court's mind. Nunakura apparently went on a rant about how Shilla had destroyed Nimna back in the days of his father, Ame Kuniyoshi. Nunakura claimed he wanted to continue his father's work, but it was unclear just where to get started. And so they decided to consult an expert. His name appears to have been something like Nichira, and possibly something like Nila, depending on the pronunciation of the Sinic characters, or Illa in modern Korean, which is Aston's preferred reading. It's said that he is the son of Arishito, or Arisatun, the Kuni no Miyatsuko, or local ruler of Ashikita, in the land of Hii in Kyushu, and we're told that he lived in Baekje, holding the rank of Talsol, the second official rank in the Baekje court. Ashikita was mentioned as far back as episode 33 during the reign of O Tarashihiko, aka Keiko Tenno, as he was trying to subdue the Kumaso, and it was likely a later addition to Yamato's sphere of influence. Nichira only makes a brief appearance here in the Nihon Shoki, and he is something of an enigma. He's presented as a citizen of Yamato, but his name appears to be from the Korean peninsula, and even his father's name harkens back to another Arishito, who may have been the king of Gara or one of the associated polities. And yet here, this Arishito is the local ruler in Ashikita, in the land of Hii, later divided into Hizen and Higo. Given that he's referenced as Hii no Ashikita no Kuni no Miyatsuko, it's been suggested that this indicated he was a member of the Hii no Kimi, the family that descended from the lords of Hii, and this may connect to something later in the story. There do appear to be some later documents that also reference Nichira. Some claim that he was a Buddhist priest, and he's even connected with the famous Shotoku Taishi in some stories, where he's depicted as a wise priest who recognizes Shotoku Taishi's own Buddha nature. Of course, at this point, the prince would only have been about 10 years old or so, assuming the dates around his birth are at all accurate. That's a subject we'll probably have to save for a later podcast, as there's just way too much around Shotoku Taishi to cover right now. As for the current story, however, Nichira was over in Baekje at the court of the Baekje king, and so it wasn't just a small matter of asking him to come to court. Ki no kuni no Miyatsuko no Oshikatsu, that is, Oshikatsu, the lord of Ki, and Kibi no Amabe no Atae no Hashima were sent on the dangerous mission of crossing the straits and bringing Nichira back from Baekje. Their mission was for naught, however. 3 months later, they returned empty-handed with the unfortunate news that the king of Baekje had refused to let Nichira leave. Apparently, his presence in Baekje was highly prized, and the Baekje king wasn't willing to part with him so easily. Yamato wasn't deterred, however, and Nunakura sent Hashima back to Baekje. This time, Hashima went straight to Nichira's house before any audiences at court. When he arrived, he heard a woman calling out in the local language, a phrase which Aston found salty enough to throw into Latin. "Let your root enter my root," she said. Despite the implied sexual innuendo of such a statement, Hashima quickly understood what she meant, and he followed her inside. She led him to Nichira, and there Hashima was asked to take a seat. Nichira acknowledged that the Baekje king was not likely to let him go if he had a choice. The king was likely afraid that if Nichira went back to Yamato, then he'd never be allowed to return back to Baekje. Therefore, Hashima had to summon all the authority vested in him by the sovereign of Yamato to demand Nichira's release in no uncertain terms. Sure enough, Hashima took the bold approach and demanded Nichira's release, and the king of Baekje finally relented and allowed him to return. He wouldn't go alone, however. Nichira was accompanied by other high officials from Baekje, including several men of the 3rd and 4th ranks and a number of sailors to transport them. They first arrived in the land of Kibi, Hashima's own home base, and then headed on to Naniwa, where Nichira was greeted by Otomo no Nukadeko no Muraji, likely a descendant of Otomo no Kanamura, the former top dog in the Yamato court. He offered Nichira condolences on the long trip he'd just had to endure and set him up in an official residence there in the port city. Later, there were daibu, that is, high officials, who were sent to the residence to attend on Nichira. After he'd had some time to freshen up, Nichira headed off to court. When he drew near, he donned a suit of armor and mounted a horse, and in such a fashion he rode straight up to the audience hall of the sovereign. There he bowed before kneeling down. He then recounted how his forefathers had been sent to the Korean peninsula up in the first place in the reign of Sengoku Tennou, aka Takeo Hiro Kuniyoshitate, in the early part of the 6th century. After explaining who he was and where he came from, he took off the armor and offered it as a gift to the sovereign himself. Off to such a great start, the sovereign had a residence constructed for Nichira in the area of Kuanoichi, that is in Ato, likely meaning an area of modern Osaka near Naniwa. Later, with all the ritual pleasantries out of the way, a war council was sent to ask Nichira just how they could move forward on the question of Nimna. This war council included Abe no Me no Omi, Mononobe no Nieko no Muraji, and Otomo no Nukadeko no Muraji. Nichira provided them a plan to go to war, but it wasn't simple nor was it quick. First, he suggested that they spend the first 3 years building up the prosperity of Yamato and getting all the people behind the government. Next, he suggested building up a massive number of ships, such that any visitors would be impressed to see them all in the harbor, and thus word would get out and it would project Yamato's military power. Finally, once that was done, Nichira suggested inviting the king of Baekje, or at least a royal representative in the form of a high prince or similar, invite them to Yamato where they could see all the power and good governance. They could then be taken to task for why Nimna had not yet been re-established. After the war council, Nichira sent a letter to the sovereign Nunakura. In it, he let Nunakura know that Baekje was going to send a request to relocate 300 ships worth of people over to Tsukushi to settle there. Here things turned rather dark as Nichira suggested that they would see the ships filled with men, women, and children, hoping to establish a Baekje colony in the archipelago. And Nichira then suggested setting up an ambush around Iki and Tsushima, and that they should slaughter every last one of them. Yeah, he was suggesting that Yamato slaughter 300 ships worth of citizens of their ally, Baekje. Then Yamato should build up fortifications of their own, probably as coastal defenses in case Baekje decided to retaliate. Again, 300 ships of Baekje men, women, and children. And here I'm going to interject that this just seems really odd and strange. First, Nichira and Nunakura were talking about trying to re-establish Nimna with their ally, Baekje, and suddenly Nichira is suggesting that Baekje might try to establish a colony in their territory, and therefore his answer to that wasn't just a polite no. No, he suggested that it be wiped out. And that all feels very extreme. And this whole passage has puzzled commenters, especially when you consider the reputation Nichira later has had as some kind of holy priest or monk. Apparently, this was the kind of advice, though, that may have been why Baekje didn't want Nichira to come in the first place. In fact, as the Baekje envoys themselves began to head out to return to Baekje, they left a couple of people in Yamato with a rather sinister plot of their own. As soon as the ships had sailed off and made considerable distance on the way back, those left behind were to assassinate Nichira. In return, they were told that they would be given a higher rank and that their families would be looked after, and the very real possibility that they were found out and killed themselves, a not insubstantial promise at the time. With the official residence in Naniwa vacated after the departure of the rest of the Baekje delegation, Nichira decided to move back in rather than staying in the home made for him in Kuwanoichi. The would-be assassins tried to approach him and hatched plot after plot. However, they were stopped because apparently Nichira had some ancient superpowers. Indeed, his body apparently glowed brightly, like a flame of fire, and so the assassins could not get anywhere near him. They had to wait until the end of the 12th month, when Nichira's own radiance faded, and they were finally able to slay him. This whole thing about radiance is intriguing, and may have several origins such that, even if it isn't factually accurate, it may have something more to say about just who Nichira was, or might have been. First off, there's the obvious. Nichi in Nichira means the sun, so it could have been a direct allusion to Nichira's name. This strikes me as also intriguing because the 12th month indicates the end of the year, usually meaning that it's darker. While the winter solstice would not have necessarily been the old 12th lunar month, those would have been the days when the sun's light was least seen. Add to this that it was at the end of the month, and based on a lunar calendar, the end and beginning of the new month would have been the times of the new moon, when it was not visible in the sky, and so we come to what was most likely the darkest night of the entire year. There's also the fact that he's from Hi no Kuni. He's even considered by some scholars to be a member of the ruling family of the land of Hi. The character of Hi in this instance is fire. Michael Como notes that the Hi no Kimi appear to have been associated with fire cults, as well as with rites of resurrection. Hi no Kimi could also be translated as Fire Lord, and there may be some connections there with the story. Finally, we can't ignore the Buddhist context. Holy individuals are often said to radiate light from their bodies. For example, we have the story about Nichira meeting the young child that would be known as Shotoku Taishi, found in the Konjaku Monogatari-shu, or Tales of Now and Then, a 12th century collection of various stories, many focused on Buddhist stories. In that particular story, Nichira radiates a light, and the Shotoku radiates a light of his own in response. In fact, the Buddhist images often depict holy figures with halos or even wreaths of flame around them, likely a depiction or literal interpretation of what we find in the Buddhist text, which may have originally been meant more metaphorically. Oh, and notice how I talked about resurrection? Maybe you thought we'd just let that one slide, but apparently there was a brief zombie moment, as Nichira suddenly came back to life after he had been killed, mainly to implicate the men from Baekje who had stayed back, and then he died again. Supposedly, this is because there was a Shilla envoy in port, and he didn't want them to take the blame. That resurrection piece, well, it wasn't the first time we've seen that, and it isn't entirely uncommon to hear about something along those lines. In the Harima Fudoki, there's another story of resurrection, and it also involves a member of the Hinokimi, or Lords of He. In that story, a member of the Hinokimi came to a center of Shilla immigrants, married a young woman whom he had brought back from the dead. Another connection between the country of He and some of what we see attributed to Nichira. At the same time, saints in ancient England would occasionally rise from their deathbeds for one last piece of wisdom or to admonish someone before laying back down in that sleep of death. And it's possible that diagnosing death versus, say, a coma or other unconscious state with very shallow breathing wasn't always a clear thing back in the day. In the West, as recently as at least Victorian times, people were so afraid of being buried alive that there were tombstones created with bells that went to a pull down in the coffin just in case. There have also been practices of pricking a corpse with a needle or similar to try to get a response. So I could believe that every once in a while a person who was declared deceased wasn't quite ready to start pushing up daisies, and it's possible that this is more of a deathbed accusation than a real resurrection. Still, the story clearly depicts it as a brief but true resurrection. From his words, the court arrested the envoys who had remained behind, threw them into some kind of confinement while they figured out what to do with them. Nichira's wife and children were moved to Kudaramura, or Baekje village in the area of Ishikawa, while the sailors who had been part of Nichira's household were settled in nearby Old Tomonomura. It's unclear if they were given leave to return to Baekje if they wanted, or if that just wasn't on the table. As for the murderers themselves, well, they weren't punished by the court. Not exactly. Rather, the court handed them over to Nichira's family, the Ashikita, for them to deliver justice. I think this is the first time we've really seen this kind of justice in the Chronicles, with the familial groups taking such a direct role. All right, so why is this story important, and what does it tell us? Well, nominally, this says something about the continuing struggle by Yamato to reestablish Nimna, but I'm not sure how much of that is accurate. Though the story starts out about consulting Nichira about Nimna, there's really almost nothing more to say on the topic, and it quickly becomes something that's almost more about the seemingly fragile Baekje-Yamato alliance. There's also an interesting side note that through all of this, there were apparently Shilla emissaries there in Yamato, even though the Chronicle claims that the last two were sent away. So, really, what's up with that? Could be that the story is anachronistic. That is, it isn't recorded in the right year, maybe not even in the right reign. Or there was a mission that just didn't rise to the level of being noticed by the chroniclers. One other thought is that the formal diplomatic ties were only some of the traffic flowing back and forth. This seems most likely to me. By this point, there was no doubt a desire for trade goods on both sides of the strait, and no matter where people came from, the merchant ships were likely plying the waters back and forth. So it's quite possible that the men of Shilla who were in port were part of a trade mission, not necessarily diplomats. Michael Como suggests some other reasons why this whole thing was considered important. He notes that there are several things here that connect this to the Abe family. It's unclear where exactly this family comes from, but they have been mentioned here or there throughout the Chronicles, with descendants coming through the royal line, and by this point they are at least fairly high up in the court. Their name is a bit of an enigma for me, and I'll probably have to do a little bit more research and come back to you with that. I do want to note that they use a different bay than that of the Mononobe or similarly created corporate families. And it's unclear to me why this would be the case unless this is just where the two seem similar. It should also be noted that we should be careful not to assume too much about the early Abe family from one of its most famous Heian-era descendants, Abe no Seimei, known as a famous onmyoji or master of yin-yang divination. I'm not entirely sure that the Abe were any more or less court ritualists than any other family, especially this early. Rather, it's their influence over certain geographic regions that is more immediately of interest. We noted that as the son of a Hino Ashikita no Kuni no Miyatsuko, Nichira was likely a member of the Hinokimi clan. They were originally based in southern Kyushu, and Komo notes that they may have been under the sway of the Abe clan at least by the 7th century, along with other notable families of Tsukushi, which is to say modern Kyushu. There are a lot of connections between Ashikita, Hi, and Shilla that are also telling. In the Harima story, it's a Shilla wife that the Hinokimi marries. When Nichira resurrects, it's specifically to ensure that the Shilla envoys who were present would not take the blame. Then there is his father's name, or more likely title, of Arishito, a term used for the king of Nimna at one point, but also for the ancient Tsunoga, who is said to have been an ancient prince from the continent. Komo suggests that Hinokuni, and thus their lords, the Hinokimi, may have played a part in the rebellion of Iwai when Iwai attempted to ally Kyushu with Shilla to break off contact between Yamato and Baekje. I suspect it's even possible that this is one of the reasons that Nichira was basically being held hostage in Baekje. Perhaps he and his family had been exiled after the rebellion, or else left before any harm could come to them. It would make some sense as to why the court sought him out in the first place. I mean, if he and his family were familiar with Shilla, perhaps the court thought he would have particular insights. Might also suggest some of his motives regarding Baekje as well. Still, the picture here is far from clear. Although the Chronicle says that Nichira was taken back to Ashikita and buried, other sources suggest that he was entombed in Naniwa at Himejima near Himegoso Shrine. This, in turn, was the home of a sublineage of the Abe family known as the Himegoso Abe. Komo suggests that by the 7th century, the Abe were appropriating various Hinokumi cultic centers to the point that by the time the Chronicles were written, the Abe no Omi and Hinokimi were claiming Kami ancestry and jointly participating in various rites. Komo then links the timing of the death of Nichira to certain court rituals of fire pacification and purification. So there may have been much more at play here than simply the story of Nimna and the attempts to re-establish that country. As for the envoys who sailed off and left their lackeys to do their bidding, apparently they were struck with a vicious bout of karma on the way back, and their boat foundered and sank. This was likely seen as nothing more than proof that their deeds had been committed with evil intent, at least by later readers, interpreting everything through a Buddhist lens that likely saw Nichira as more saintly than it seems he truly was, at least from the reading I'm getting. After all that, though, there's no evidence that the court really pulled any of it off. Instead, in 584, the year after everything had gone down with Nichira, the court sent Naniwa no Kishi no Kitahiko off to Nimna, now controlled by Shilla, presumably to negotiate for some kind of reinstatement. So much for waiting 3 years to get everything together. That, of course, doesn't appear to have happened, and the year after that, in 585, there was one more attempt, this time by Sakata no Mimiko no Miko. Sakata had previously been sent on a mission to request Shilla re-establish Nimna in 571, only months before the sovereign Ame Kuniyoshi died. Now, just as he was about to set out, the sovereign and the powerful Mononobe no Moriya suddenly came down with a pestilence, and they were ridden with sores such that they called off all preparations for the mission. Sure enough, later that year, Ame Kuniyoshi's successor, Nunakura Fotadamashiki, likewise passed away. I guess the rule here is don't send Sakata no Mimiko to try to demand anything about Shilla, or you might die. Of course, I have to wonder if there isn't something else going on. It's suspicious that the chroniclers recorded 2 missions to Shilla, both led by the same guy, both about re-establishing Nimna, and both happening just before the sovereign passes away. Maybe history really repeated itself like this, or maybe the chroniclers just knew that such a mission was sent in the last year of one of these reigns and put it in both. We also don't hear anything else about the unfortunate envoy, Sakata no Mimiko, either. The other interesting thing to note is that, like Ohowake no Miko, Mimiko is apparently a certified royal prince, though I don't immediately see any name connected with him, at least not in the immediate lineage. It's been suggested that this is one of the sons of Ohoro no Ookimi, aka Keitai Tennou, though even that feels tenuous to me. Either way, it does seem that Nunakura passed away from the disease sweeping the land, as we noted last episode. Which means that concludes the reign of Nunakura. Next, we'll get into what happened after his death as we start to see the Soga influence become preeminent. There's more to say about the growth of Buddhism and about the clash between the Soga and the Mononobe, one of the formative conflicts from this early period. And of course, we've already caught glimpses of Prince Umayado, aka Cho Tokutaishi, who had quite the impact on the court, assuming he even existed. But that's all a discussion for another episode. Until then, thank you for listening and thank you for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our Ko-fi site, ko-fi.com/sengokudaimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. That's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.